so this means it's real.
If I can figure out how to get this shared again. Let's see if I can make this work.
I believe in you.
I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. Who can share? Wait a minute. Assuming only I can share.
And one quick thing, we've got a new person. Joe's brother from California is joining us. So hi, Patrick. If you would like, I can turn your camera off. Would that be okay?
That's fine.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do that for you. Okay, perfect. All right, everybody. Russ, this is your time to shine.
All right. Are you seeing my screen at this point?
Yep.
All right, then I'm going to go ahead and start the show. First of all, hi everybody. Good to see you. I'm glad you're all here. We're here for the last episode of Travel in the 19th Century, and thank you so much for sticking around for this. This time we're going to be talking about the Pony Express, and I'm kind of excited about that. And I guess I know you all just muted yourself, but am I correct to say that we all still think highly of the Pony Express? Is it still something that's exciting to everyone? You know, with these classes, I like to take people on a trip back into history, and one of the things that I still think of is when you mention the Pony Express to most people, they get excited. It's something exciting. It's an experience. It's actually something that almost everybody at least knows the concept of. Would you all agree that that's true? And I'm hoping that is the case, that I'm not missing it. But, you know, since we're taking this trip back in time, one of the things I want you to all realize is I'm going to try to be mentioning that there are some places where we can actually still, 160 years later, we can still go places and see buildings that they actually used. But before we get there, you all know that I have to ask you. You have to tell me, and you're going to need to practice your unmuting just briefly, or maybe Mara will unmute everybody for us. You have to tell me one thing that you learned last week. Just one thing.
Ed and Cindy are unmuted?
Yes, we are.
Go ahead.
One thing we thought was pretty interesting was that we didn't realize how the stratification of people on the riverboats went. You had upper deck, lower deck, and the idea of getting off and loading wood and that kind of stuff is part of your fare. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a single movie or TV show that even remotely brought that up. That there was
even jump back to the previous week.
Yeah.
I can no longer watch a Western movie because of you, Russ, because I'm looking for that rail on top of the stagecoach. I haven't seen one yet.
Haven't seen one yet, and neither have I. Thank you. That's so good. Anybody else out there? You know, we were talking about steamboats, what it meant, you know, to everyone, what we actually were getting. But, you know, we were speaking of how vital river traffic was to moving all these goods. And I've got a picture over here on the left. That's the lower Missouri, just from St. Louis up to Council Bluffs. And then, of course, we're also speaking of how, you know, the upper Missouri would become the focus because, of course, remember from this entire time period, we're really focusing in pretty much 1845 to 1870, 1875 in this set of courses. And, you know, one of the things that's true throughout all of that is gold dust fever hit everyone and changed the course of this country. Think about it, and it's going to be very, very important during this class. You know, we're speaking of all of the different times that people in America just moved in mass trying to get to the goal. And
Dr. Dunker has unmuted, so I think you might have something to share.
Perfect.
It just took me a while, Mara. Jan and I did not realize that there were so many wrecks along the river. We knew there were some, but not the magnitude that you taught us about last week, Russ.
Yeah, and that is so true. There are so many, and there's so many so near us. You know, they always spoke that area just north of Kansas City was so bad, but the reality is, you know, what we know as Blackbird Bend and the overlook that's down there that many of you have probably stood on, there must be at least probably 8 to 10 wreck sites within your view from that spot, from that bluff. And then I never knew growing up, and I'd like to think about this, never knew growing up that there was a wreck right there at what we'd consider Ponca State Park, which was the Ponca Landing. And of course, right across from that was that Dakota Point that we were talking about as well, the wooding areas. So those are pretty big. And why, you know, one of the things I want to remember is, you know, everybody just always says the railroad killed steamboats. And in reality, there's truth to that, but you have to think about it. Railroad came to Sioux City in 1868, and it made Sioux City because of the connection, what I called the rail to river connection, because it brought all those goods that we were then shipping upriver to all these forts that you see on your screen. And that's a pretty big deal. I'd also like you to just take this moment to notice all the way out there to the left, Fort Benton, and how far up that is. And we'll be talking about that. But note the statement I made before. When the railroad got here, it cut 1,000 miles, 20 days, and it cut the insurance to a third. Because, of course, they didn't have to go through that whole area of the wrecks then after that, did they? Now they could make new wrecks up this far, you know. So, but I guess the thing I'd like you thinking about that I'm hoping you would get from all of this is that the longer an area was settled, the more items that needed shipped out. In other words, there was more local development. When it first starts, everything's being shipped in. That's one of the things I'd like you to remember. When the riverboats first get to an area, they're bringing all the things that area needs. But after they've been there a while, suddenly that area is now generating produce or materials or something that's being shipped out to other places. In other words, more local development. And just as a reminder, and I don't know that I pointed out, but note the steamboats on the river there. This is Sioux City. How close, you know, a block and a half, 2 blocks at the max from the railroad depot at 2nd and Douglas down to the levee, right? And Sioux City tripled in size in 3 years, from 1,500 to 4,500, from 1868 to 1871. That's amazing. And although it only has the exclusive rights for 2 to 3 years, it set Sioux City on its path. It was very, very profitable. And you saw them building. You saw people coming. It was the spot. And Yankton never did close that gap, even though they became the next rail to river spot. So, and I want you to remember this statement that I'd said early on. One of the first mayors of Sioux City said, "The Big Muddy now brings us cash instead of corn. And it takes from us our corn instead of our cash. Our levee is our market." And that's so, so true. And I talked about one of the first major, the first 3-story brick building in Sioux City. And it was put up, it's called the Sawyer Block because it was put up by Sawyer, and he was a prominent steamboat guy. Just a few pictures, just so you can enjoy them. Don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about these. This is the far west, which had this interior shot. It's one of the few interior shots I could find. But the trip on the riverboat had to be better than that trip on the stagecoach, right? Well, it kind of depended on the trip, didn't it? This one wasn't too good. Now, I'd mentioned Mark Twain's comment about they sparred off so frequently, and that's when they take those two front items and stick them down into the sandbar because they've gotten lodged on a sandbar. They'd use that to push down. The front end of the boat would lift up slightly. They'd reverse the paddle wheel and push water under the front and hopefully be able to back up and get either another run at it or find the channel. Or, as Mark Twain talks about, if that all fails, then you just use the spars to turn you around and try and push you forward over it as well. Not as good a plan. Now, another person, and I love this comment, I meant to bring it up last week. This is in the Sioux City Journal. A person that had never traveled on the Missouri River steamer is bound to become impatient by the slow progress and detention caused by sandbars. The pilots had a wonderful knowledge of the river, said this passenger on the Nellie Peck, docked at Sioux City that day. They know every sandbar between Sioux City and St. Louis, and in order to prove it, they hit every one. I just enjoyed that. By the way, the Nellie Peck is the second from the left in this picture. These boats that you see there are the Sioux City contingent of steamboats for the line that's based in Sioux City at that point. And here's that wreck picture that I was talking about. Notice Burt County and the bend there, how many, those are two on a line in most cases. Plus you get up towards Sioux City, the one at Ponca, things like that. It's a tough business, and it got tougher every year as the competition increased and the profits decreased. So, one thing I wanted you to remember, what were the limits on river travel? Time of year. Steamboat travel was slow but very important. And why is the travel on the Missouri so different than steamboat travel on the Mississippi? There's two major reasons. One, the Missouri is not as deep or as wide, but what that means is when the current's flowing, it's very strong in the channel. And that makes it tougher, but also you're not able to have as much maneuver room. It keeps plowing out more ground and dumping more things in. But a big thing to remember is by the time the steamboat was coming along and was able to go up the Mississippi, people had already reached the Mississippi. We talked about that. By the turn of the century, people essentially were populating the east coast of the Mississippi. You know, Iowa becomes populated over the next 40 to 60 years. Remember, Sioux City isn't even settled until the 1850s. So the steamboat is coming up and past Sioux City long before there are lots of places, shall we say, to stop. So you're not servicing the same kind of business. And again, that's what I was getting at about that. In the early days, you're bringing things to an area. In later days, you're taking it away because that area is already developed. And that's a big difference then on the Mississippi. They're already servicing developed areas. So all of that, hopefully that reminds you what we were doing last week. Because, and why do I do that? I want to just make sure you understand. You know, as I said, you do this for a long time. The key to learning anything is you hear it or you experience it, but until you process it and put it into long-term storage. Processing then means pull it back out, look at it a couple of times to think about it and put it back. If you know, and one of the best ways to do that, tell somebody about this class tomorrow. Tell somebody something you heard, and it'll stick with you a lot longer that way. If you use it within 24 hours, you find that in 6 months, you'll still remember it. Whereas if you don't use it in 24 hours, you don't even have to go 6 days and you don't remember it. So, this being 7 days, that's why I'm doing it. All right, so tonight's agenda, I want to look at what was the need for the Pony Express? Why did we need it? Then I just want to take some time seeing what they saw, hearing their stories, and then I want to evaluate the Pony Express experiment, because that's really kind of what it was, wasn't it? It was something pretty new, and we're going to talk about what made it new. I mean, we talked in the first class about what came after the stagecoaches were bringing people. The stagecoaches started bringing mail to everyone, right? It was the mail that would actually keep the stagecoaches in business. And just as I said, even after the railroad comes to an area, steamships didn't go away immediately. They were around another 40, 45 years until the railroad had reached almost everywhere that they could do a lot of traffic with. So big changes happen. Now, we're also kind of doing this a little backwards because we're stepping back a little earlier. The things we discussed with steamboats were mostly between 1860 and 1870, 75, somewhere in there. This one, we're going back a little bit. We're going to be talking about things in really 1855 to 1861. And really, when we get down to the Pony Express, when did it happen? They got the idea and started putting it together, as we'll see, in 1859. They started in 1860. And we're going to talk about when they went out of business. So remember, the goal of my classes, I want to sort the myths and the legends and the facts. I don't want to dismiss any of them. Myths have their place. Myths inspire us. Myths are stories that sometimes we use to get people to try to be more than maybe what they are. They're the reason we think about it. I mean, was everybody involved in the American Revolution a selfless patriot? No. But it kind of comes down to us that way a lot of times, right? But those myths are important because they inspire us. Legends are the people who truly did those incredible things. People like, if we were talking about the American Revolution, George Washington. Well, we're going to be talking about one of the legends today of American history, which is the Pony Express. And I really put it down to that. It is a legend. But we are going to try and sort some of the myths from the facts, okay? That's my goal for this class. And that is not to degrade the myths or the facts, but to elevate them so that we know the difference, okay? So here are the questions I want you considering as we go forward. Is the Pony Express well regarded by the public? I asked you that at the start, and you probably have an answer for that. So I want you thinking about that. Is it well regarded by the public? And if so, how do historians treat it? And I think that might actually surprise you. And then I want to talk about what is the legacy of the Pony Express. Now, to do all this, I'm going to talk about everything that happened, and it's a pretty short time frame, so it's pretty easy to talk about it. Now, here are the things I want you to think about. So far, we have focused on the modes of travel, by wagon, by stagecoach, by horse. And this is a picture of the Mormons crossing Iowa, actually. And that was in 1846. I'm picking these dates for a reason. They had hoped, they were being thrown out of Illinois and pursued, and they had hoped to get across Iowa very quickly. It didn't turn out that way. Even though they were going east-west, we had said the stagecoach could cross that in a certain amount of time. You'd think that the wagons and really the pull carts that many of them had would at least get there. They should have been able to do it quickly, but they couldn't. It didn't work right. And part of that is just due to the weather. But it should have been no longer than 10 days. It took them an entire month. That's kind of impressive, right? Now, jump ahead 10 years to when we were talking about last time, and I gave examples, that it took a minimum of 8 days to essentially go from Muscatine to Council Bluffs by stagecoach. And that was at a time that only took them 2 to 3 days, thanks to the new railroad, getting them from all the way from New York to Chicago. So we've shortened this a lot, but it still takes days. It still took a week to get across Iowa, and it would take another 3 to 5 days to get to Sioux City. And again, all of this depends on the weather, doesn't it? So jump another 5 years ahead, and Sioux City took 27 days. Right, I pointed out where Fort Benton was. Even after we get to that point of the railroad, and Sioux City's now the jumping off spot, when the weather is right, when the river is high enough, they could set a record of 35 days for a round trip. Now it's 27 to go up, and they could go downriver in 6 days if they didn't have to pick up a lot of things, stop and make things to pick up. And that record they were setting the first time of a 35-day round trip all the way to Fort Benton. That meant they didn't get stuck. They did not hit too many sandbars or anything because the river was high. It could take a lot longer than that during tough times. By the way, this is one of the examples, boy, Sioux City, the Northwest Transportation Company, and that's who owned the ships that we were talking about, the Sioux City to Fort Benton run. And we focused on the transportation first of people. I was talking about wagons, I was talking about these items, but then following that, we of course were talking about the transportation of goods. And then after that, the transportation of information, mail, right? News. Because you're out here on the frontier. Sioux City at that point was a frontier town in 56, and the news coming back from the east might be important. Why would that be? By the way, I did find this graphic, and I hope it works for you. Each of these lines gives you an idea of how long it takes to get from New York to where that line is. So notice in 1800, it was 6 weeks to get close to where Iowa, the east coast of Iowa, you hadn't even got that far. Remember I was talking about at 1800, nothing moved faster than the speed of a horse. And I was specifically saying not a letter, not an idea, not an order, not an instruction. And manufactured things could take far longer because of the weight, right? But now jump ahead to that 1857 and look that dark line. If you look down at the bottom on the Texas-Louisiana border, we see it's 1 week to reach that dark line in 1857. Much of that is due to railroad getting you all the way across to, 1858 to Sioux City in just a few days. And then jumping off from, say, Council Bluffs, you can see that 1 week might stretch you all the way out to Kearney. Pretty impressive, right? And, some of these lines are just approximations, so we have to watch it, but it gives you the idea of how much and how fast locomotives changed everything, right? Notice as well, the South is not as rich in locomotive power. They have decided to stay since they have one principal crop, and it's not a crop that necessarily has to get to market quickly, and that crop being cotton. It's got a time frame. They're perfectly willing to continue to carry it the old-fashioned way and not have to pay somebody else to do that. But that means they get behind on railroad production, which will cost them during the war. Okay, now remember the era we're speaking of, and I just referenced the war. Well, of course, in 1850, nobody knew that a war was coming, but everybody knew news mattered. And consider this, California is going to become a state in 1850 because between hearing about the gold rush in late 48 and all the way through 49, it becomes an overpopulated area. And remember, travel's important. 35 days to the gold regions if you take a steamship. And that, notice it says Nicaragua. The steamship takes you from New York around through and drops you at the isthmus. There's a small railroad train that can take you across the isthmus. You pick up another steamship and you go on up to California. So it takes some time. And remember, originally the people from Nebraska and especially Colorado were the ones that got out to uh, California first during that initial rush. But in other words, news and when you get it is very important, isn't it? But it's also important because that last 10 years before the Civil War, there were lots of things happening, and the country was pulling hard at the binds, the things that bind us together. Now, also remember, and we need to keep this in mind, you know, that era of the individual going out to California was very short-lived, and really only that first year. After that, they got out there and they found that they weren't going to get rich immediately. Many of them had to go to work for groups that were saying, well, we're going to make a bigger deal of this. We're going to digging. We're going to create mines. We're going to create sluices. We're going to do all these things, and that requires expense. Expense requires capital. And think about this: those banks out there, if there is turmoil in the East, those banks out there may be not so excited to loan money if they're not sure what's going to happen in the country. So news has a value. And while there's fortunes being made, we see also that there's a bigger fortune. The ones that will make the fortune that will stick with them are the ones that are supplying the goods rather than the people. It's not necessarily the transportation, but the transportation either of goods to those people or information to those people that are already out there becomes very important. And just a few names that will go on to become pretty big. Studebaker for making first carts, then wheelbarrows, then wagons that will actually allow people to carry more and more items well. Levi Strauss for creating clothing that is durable. Wells Fargo for what? For transporting people, for transporting letters and mail and other items of in some cases, some slightly bigger items, but not too big. Well, another group that would actually make their money are those ones following afterwards. The federal government is saying, we understand that we need this information out there. So they've got government contracts, they've got awards, and they give one to the Overland Mail, and that goes out on October 10th, 1858. They've given this contract, and those folks on the Overland Mail group have said, we've got this figured out. We're going to follow the Santa Fe Trail because it's safe, and it took them 23 days, 21 hours. In other words, 24 days. And everybody was thrilled because that's better than that 35 days we saw for the steamships. The news was over a month old by the time it got out there with the steamships, right? So now we're cutting that down to almost 3 weeks, well, 3.5. And information can be money, can't it? Let's remember why this is important. Look what's happening during these years. You've got national unrest. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has completely upset the Missouri Compromise, which had kept the Union together. The country's unsettled. You have a series of weak presidents that keep getting elected, or they die in office if they do have some strength. But it's a good business climate because we've got all this gold and this silver being found, but things are really, really tough. And right at the time Sioux City's being founded, you've got this new party trying to satisfy people because the Whig Party no longer is meeting the needs of the people that it has. And this is back in a time when your parties stood for something instead of saying, no, I'll stand for anything you'll vote for. Parties actually meant, we know you believe this and that's what we believe, so we want you as part of our party. And the Whigs had lost those people just as the Federalists had lost people before that. And Fremont becomes, in 1856, becomes the first presidential candidate for this new party, the Republicans, who strongly believed that slavery was, especially slavery was wrong, but they weren't willing to say slavery had to go away, but they were saying slavery had to stay out of the new territories, that it could not be allowed to spread. And that put them then at the other side of the party then that was the Democrats. And with that split, there was also other parties running, since the Northern and Southern Democrats didn't see things exactly the same. And what happens is Buchanan, who's from Pennsylvania, manages to win, because he wins by about 43,000 votes total. And he does that by winning Pennsylvania. That's just enough to give him a majority electoral college. He barely won it. Had Fremont won it, he would not have won the election. It would have been thrown to the House of Representatives. Now, point to all that is, that's kind of important to know if you're depending on government contracts to do anything. And of course, people in California by 1856 they're already a state. They want their own mint. They want things to be done in their way for them, and they want contracts to get mail to them, to get equipment to them, and everything else. And they're big people pushing for the idea of a continental railroad, transcontinental railroad, and that means they need somebody to supply some of the working capital and come up with ways to get that. So all of these pressures are out there. Information is really vital at this point. Now, I'd said that other group had gotten the mail contract in 58. You can see that lower green line is the way they're going. We're going to see something with that in a moment. But what happens is a California senator, and I've seen his name spelled both Gwin and Gwinn, but we'll pronounce it Gwin, convinces William Russell to develop that he should develop a central mail route, because Russell's already partners with a guy, and they're providing a lot of the oxen that are coming across that central route already. They've already got some of these things in place. And Gwynn's saying, man, if you do this, we can get you the contract. You'll get the whole contract. You really need to do this. It'll be worth your while. I can help swing it to you. Now, the interesting thing is William Russell agrees in principle with him, and basically does a handshake. Yes, we're going to do this. We're going to make it happen. And so much to the point that they actually start working on it. And we see that by March 17th, the word is getting out in 1860. The San Francisco Bulletin has an announcement in it that the new Pony Express is going to run from New York City to San Francisco. It's going to get you news from New York City, San Francisco in only 9 days. Now, we know the Pony Express doesn't go from New York, but the point is, New York can now get the information all the way to Missouri. And how is that? Because in the 1840s to early 1850s, there's been a new piece of technology called the telegraph. And it took the guy quite a while to get Congress's attention, but he finally got some, and he was able to transmit on a small wire from Baltimore to DC on one of the political conventions. And thus they saw, wow, instantaneous news. Well, by 1860, that telegraph wire is all the way to St. Joseph, Missouri. That's pretty big, because now you can transmit to there and you can go on from St. Joe. Now, Russell was already partners with a guy named Waddell, and they did wholesale trading. At the same time, there was a guy named Majors who had contracts with all the military outposts. They knew Each of them had something that could help the other. They had gotten together, and it had been with those major contracts and getting the oxen and the goods to these forts, just like we saw Sioux City was doing up in the upper area with the steamboats. These guys are doing it by transportation through the center of the country, because of course there's military forts being built all the way out along the Oregon Trail. So they're supplying those things. Neither of the other two were very happy with Russell about making this agreement to do the Pony Express. But they went along with him rather than invalidate the agreement that he had signed, since he was their Washington contact, to keep from invalidating, to making him look bad. They agreed to do it. And they used the concept that the Oregon Trail is going to be the starting point, and what they'd already developed will be the starting point for the Pony Express. So, just to make sure you understood, Russell worked in Washington. That was his area. Majors was at home out in the wild. He liked hiring crews. He was the guy that would put together the riders and the station personnel. And Waddell was the business guy. He was the numbers guy, and he was going to stay back he was originally in Lexington, Missouri, but he would move very shortly with this to St. Joseph, Missouri, and he would manage the business and the payroll. Now, all of these things are vital. By the way, what you're seeing here is their first stable is still in existence down in St. Joe. Now, they rebuilt it in, I think, 1888 into brick, but used some of the materials from the original, and it's in the same area, same spot as the original wooden stables that they used during the first runs of the Pony Express. Kind of cool. You can go down and visit it. And I'm sure when we get through with all this and when the COVID stuff goes away, we can talk Mara into making that one of our trips, right? Okay. So the key is, they know that you can't just, the problem with the stagecoach taking so long, you can't run horses flat out constantly. And of course, across the central area, there's places where you're going to need to cross runs and streams and everything else. And to do that quickly, you can't do that with a coach or a wagon. You're going to use horses, but by the same token, what they're going to do is a relay of riders. Now, they're going to cover almost 2,000 miles, because remember, there's twists and turns and ups and downs. So while it might list out as 1,830 miles, I'm quite sure they would probably actually run across 2,000 miles or close to it. Now, the other thing you have to remember, because this ends up being such a short-lived company, records are sporadic. You've got stories out there for everything. And in digging into this, it actually took me longer than I thought, because of that issue of legends, myths, and facts. We loved, especially in the West, we loved our myths that turned into legends that start getting reported as facts. So, but it's almost 2,000 miles. It's really almost hard to imagine doing this at this time, because once really past Kearney, you're really into wilderness, and you're also starting to move out beyond what we would deem civilization at this point, right? But they pull it all together. They pulled it together very quickly. To do so, they had to build stations. They had to buy horses. They had to put together people. They had to find riders. And remember, all of these stations had to have a station master. And then if stations are every 15 to 20 miles, depending on the type of land you're running through, at that point then about every 60 to 75 miles, you needed to have a place that was more than a station. There was a set of stables, that was a set of of bunkhouses or whatever where people could actually sleep, because what's going to happen is these riders would run as far as they could, and generally speaking, that would be 75 to 100 some miles a day max generally. Now that's going to be a little farther in our area, but what's actually going to happen then with that is um, those guys will then, after resting up, they'll start going back the other way, because we never talk about this. I'm saying on April 3rd at 5 p.m. It's actually turns out to be about 5:20, and we'll talk about why. Um, a rider leaves St. Joseph, Missouri with a 30-pound mail bag. All right, great. What we don't talk about is at the same time that he's leaving from this end, at about 3 p.m. on April 3rd, in other words, with the time zone changes, there's a guy leaving Sacramento with an equal mail bag. They will run simultaneously across the country and pass each other eventually. And thus it will go both ways. Now, they were talking out of their heads, but they guaranteed that they would meet a 10-day delivery. And the irony is, they did. The idea is absolutely mind-boggling to even think about it. As I write here, it's as audacious as it is brilliant. And from the very start, from the very beginning, this entire concept captures America's interest. By the way, I love this statue. This is outside Marysville, Kansas, because Marysville is far enough away from St. Joe that that's one of the places they put the first big stable and building. So you've got, as I said, about every 15 to 20 miles, and of course they're going to be further apart in the plains. They're going to get to that 20 miles or so. In the mountains and everywhere else, it's got to be shorter because it takes them longer to travel that distance. But about every 20 miles out here in the plains, you're going to see a station, maybe 15 miles. And they've already got part of this in place, because remember, they were sending these oxen and things, and they would replace different items. So, we've captured the American interest. Stories are being written about this immediately, especially after that first 10 days, and that mail gets there. It shows up in Sacramento, and it's only 10 days old. It's not 35 days old the way the steamboat's been bringing it. It's not 24 or 25 days old the way the stagecoach has been bringing it. And the stagecoach had a habit of slipping off their amount. They rarely ever did better than that first run. They averaged about 24, 25 days, but because of weather and the things we talked about before, if things didn't work out right along that Santa Fe route, they could end up being delayed. So suddenly this mail is going through. Now remember, most of it is telegrams. They're all on the thinnest paper, and you can kind of see how the mail bags are there. It goes over the saddle. The guy is sitting on it. He cannot lose that mail bag. The only way that mail bag's getting lost is if he gets lost, because it's going with him. So, and here is a rather scenic picture of the route, and each of those little dots is one of the stations. And this kind of gives you a feeling, realize our highways, for the most part, go right along where these routes are. Whereas we have many places where the railroad does not go along what eventually became the highways. We definitely see that you can mostly take highways that will end up going along where this route was, because it was the best route possible that they could find across these places. Here's a close-up picture of that item, and one of this quote is actually from one of the writers. Now, again, I have a hard time separating it. History says there were as many as 190 stations. Some places say 184. Some places say it's in the high 170s. But some places will say, no, there were 190 stations, deal with it. Our equipment was very simple. In front of every station, when the driver was due, the horse stood out at the rack, bridled, saddled, ready to go. Now, the idea was in the early days, they had somebody, if there was a hill, on a hillside before the station watching for the rider, and they would blow a bugle to alert everybody that the rider was coming so that they would get everything ready that needed to get ready. Because if this was not the end of that rider's run, and remember, for the most part, he was going to go through probably 5 horse changes before he stopped being the rider. If we're going 75 to 105 miles and they're 15 miles apart, he might do 5 or 6 or 7, 6 horse changes before he's through for his run. And that's going to take him most of a day because you're running these horses flat out. They can't go much more than 10 or 15 miles. And that's going to depend on, again, the terrain. But it's a very, what you see here, the thing with the male actually slides over the top of the saddle horn, and in this one's case, you see it slides over the back of the saddle too. So they're not saddling up a horse after he gets there. He's taking the male bag, which cinches underneath the horse. When he gets off the horse, he quickly uncinches it. You see one of the pieces hanging down there on the far side. It's a single cinch. You throw it back on that horse, you cinch it quickly, you jump on it, and you're going. That's all the time there is. He's not stopping at any of these break points. By the way, here is that Pony Express station in Marysville. A little farther down the road, and it's a state park in Kansas. It's in Hanover, Kansas. You know, they're following the Oregon Trail. Now, that doesn't mean that it's an easy trail to follow in 1860, even though by this time there are hundreds, if not thousands, of wagons going along this trail over time. Yeah, it's not so busy that it's crowded, but certainly he's going to come upon wagon trains and other groups using this during season. Remember, they don't stop for the seasons. They continue, and they continue through the night as well. You don't stop at night. Somebody else takes over. Now, this is the station that we see down there in Kansas. That building's still there. You can visit it. And here's a metal emblem that's on that Marysville station. 1,200 freight wagons were on this highway, drawn by 10,000 yoke of oxen, with music of 1,200 cracking whips and creaking wagon wheels. Now that's a story in the Nebraska Historical Society, and that's going to be over time, but they are saying there are people that are already stopping also at these stations. Most of these stations are a stagecoach station. Most of these stations do function also for that business that I said that Russell, Majors, and Waddell had of getting things out to these military posts as well, right? Rock Creek Station is just across the border then between Kansas and Nebraska. It's by Fairbury. Swiftly running horses were kept saddled and bridled at readiness for the arrival of the Pony Express rider, who changed his mount in 10 seconds, was racing off through the darkness of night or the heat of the day across the continent. And they say there are some 53 stations in Nebraska alone. Nebraska's a pretty long state, right? And there's a lot of them out there. This is one that's in Gothenburg, Nebraska. It was closer to Fort McPherson, and they moved it into town. But one of the things they never tell you, and I've been at this station a number of times, but until I was doing this research, I didn't notice this. It was originally a 2-story station when it was out by the fort. They actually had stables, and it was originally called the Samuel Machete Station. So, since they only could go 10 to 15 miles, They had to make new stations when they started doing the Pony Express because that was much different. They would run the horses harder than they would for their stagecoaches. Now, as I said, every 100 miles or so, there's a larger station, and then the farther out they got, since they had to have stables and they needed places for people to stay, often if they could, they put them within forts. And this is a picture of one at Fort Bridger in Wyoming, which served as a Pony Express station, an overland stage station. And later, and this is kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen, the Transcontinental Telegraph Station. So the Army was in Fort Bridger between 1857 and 1890. What's important about those years? That's also the years of the highest activity in the Plains and Indian Wars, right? This is another shot. This is actually, I believe, a shot from during the time of the CCC. You can see they've got the original stables there, but they've put these awning roofs over them to protect them from further weathering. So this is also at Fort Bridger. Now in Utah Territory, we've got a little different things. We don't have a lot of trees, so let's build them out of rock. This is the station at Simpson Springs. This station is interesting. It's in Wyoming. In reality, the fact that the walls are there, you know, all the wooden pieces are gone, but the rock walls are still there. What's interesting about that is a lot of it is in such good shape because it was completely buried by sand shortly after these guys left it in the 1860s, and it would end up not being discovered until 1970 by archaeologists that were working with the groups trying to trace the history of the trail. Now, it had a visitor way back then. Whoops, a second here. Had a visitor, and they had something to say about this location, which they didn't like much. The water near this vile hole was thick and stale with sulfury salts. It blistered even the hands, wrote a visitor. The station house was so unfit, and it was an object for such a scene, roofless and chairless, filthy, squalid, with smoky fire in one corner and a table in the center, with an impure floor, the walls open to every wind, and the interior full of dust. Now, when he said roofless, he really meant that if there was rain or anything falling through, it would come through. It actually had a roof at that time. This is a journalist that was passing through. He was actually from England. He was passing through to go to California in 1860 to write back about what things were. And he was telling it like he saw it. In fact, he mentions to the fact he's so bitter. He's talking about how pitiful the all of the station personnel are at this location. And that brings us up to a point. We talk about the writers all the time, but we need to mention that, of course, it's the station personnel that are really doing a lot of the day-to-day work. You've got the guys out there getting all the glory that are the writers, but in reality, those station personnel are the ones shoveling out the stables, feeding the horses, taking care of everything, keeping everybody together. And realize as we get out there to Utah Territory, which comprises the area we now think of as Utah and Nevada, you were getting into a hostile area because you had more and more people after the California gold rush. You had more and more people when they thought they had found gold or silver in that area that suddenly poured in as well into what we consider the Nevada area today. And that, of course, will annoy the natives. By the way, we've got some pictures, actually, of some of these writers. This is Frank E. Webner. And you might think he looks a little young. All of the Pony Express writers were young. Technically, you had to be 14 to actually ride for them, but they wanted experienced horsemen. They wanted people that were not very big. And what would happen is if you happened to say you were 14, even though you were 11, you could get away with it. These two people, Johnson Richardson on the left and Johnny Fry on the right. Fry is believed to be that first rider that started out from St. Joseph on April 3rd. So, and I'd said I was going to tell you a story. He started at 20 after, not because he was late, but because the train was late. And in fact, it was such a big deal, an important deal, and one of the items they were carrying was from the president, remarking about how remarkable this entire affair was. They put on a special, cleared all the tracks so that messenger that was bringing mail from the east could actually at least get there close to on time, and got across Missouri because of that. Now, to become a Pony Express rider was not a small deal. You had to swear an oath, to the company, but essentially before God, that my engagement, and while I'm an employee of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, I will under no circumstances use profane language, that I will drink no intoxicating liquors, that I will not quarrel or fight with any other employee of the firm, and that in every respect I will conduct myself honestly and faithfully to my duties and be direct in my actions to win the confidence of my fellows and my fellow workers. These guys were religious. And in fact, what they would do then is they would give each of them, they did not carry much with them. They essentially carry a canteen or a water bag, a pistol, and the Bible that they are given by the company to go with them. So interesting things. And it was not they, considering they wanted nothing of extra weight. Originally, the first runs they carried a rifle, but it was deemed that it was too heavy, and they stopped bringing the rifles with them. Here's three more: John Fisher on the left, John Hancock, and John Fisher's little brother, Billy Fisher. They're all riders for the Pony Express, and they would go on. The Fishers would go on. I think Billy goes on to be a big rancher, but John goes on to sit in the territorial legislature in Utah. Now, one of the ones people always tell me is that, Buffalo Bill Cody was a Pony Express rider, and there's some doubt about that. And you've got historians that say absolutely not, that at best he was a messenger for the company, and everybody agrees he did help building some of the stations when he was young, but while you have stories that say he's the one that made the fastest and longest trip ever, you've got others that contest that. But it goes down in history that Bill Cody was a writer for the Pony Express, even though historians say absolutely not. Now, bringing up historians, of course, I'd said, how do historians look at the Pony Express? This is one of their problems. It was so popular and so much was written about it that they have a hard time deciphering it. More importantly, for historians that are so into all the news and all the things that are happening in that 1850s, they look at this small company that never made a profit, didn't do all that well, and was really only in business for 18 to 19 months. They have a hard time taking it seriously. But they all have learned that if you don't talk about it in your history books are not going to be appreciated by the majority of the people who are paying for those history books. Now, we always hear about Indian attacks. In reality, there weren't that many attacks on the riders, but in April and May, the Pyramid Lake War. It's the Paiute War erupted in what we would call Nevada because of all those silver seekers that were pouring into the area, and the Paiutes understood that this was going to change their life, much like it did for everyone out in the other places. Almost through. I see the time.
I know you see. I have to go though because I have to put Elliot to bed. So I'm gonna let you take over, and then I'm out of here. Okay.
So just to finish it up, Dan Drumhelder was one of those. Drumheller was one of those people that he got $150 a month. Now that's usually cited as being the money that all the writers got. The writers didn't all get that. You were writing through Nebraska, they figured you didn't have to do much. You were writing through Paiute country, you were trying to get away from people frequently. He got 150, but the average still got 100 because you're asking these guys to go out and do the impossible and to commit to the fact that they would not abandon that mail. Now, Drumheller, after he had actually helped get things started, goes on to be one of their writers. And one night he arrives and finds his station tender is dead and has been mutilated. He's been attacked by the natives. And with no replacement horses to be found and no reason to hang around, he rides on. His journey that night's going to be twice his usual distance, but he was certainly happy to escape what he termed as Old Winnemucca and his band of pirates. Winnemucca, of course, was the chief in charge. This is that part about Bill Cody. He's credited with the longest ride in history. It's when his relay partner is killed, supposedly. Buffalo Bill continues to ride, traveling 322 miles in 21 hours and 40 minutes. It required 21 horses for that. Now, historians contend that that should be credited to the guy known as Pony Bob Halsum, who went 380 miles during the Paiute Indian raid on relay stations. They really believe that the Bill Cody story is one of those dime novels that the penny books that are being created at that time, and they have conflated the two stories. But Bob Halsum is certainly credited with his ride, and nobody disputes it. Now here's a young looking guy, right? This is Richard Regan. They end up calling him Raz because his father, Egan, Major Egan, actually is a station master. He's got the fastest run in history, finishing a 75-mile segment in 4.5 hours instead of the usual 5.5 hours. One time he comes upon a stage that's been held up, all the passengers were killed, and then he ends up being chased by the natives. He actually gets away from them. Another time on a dark night, his horse and he were crossing a bridge. They fall off it. He's thrown into the icy water, but he'd held on to the mail. He lost the horse. He had to walk 5 miles back to the station to get another horse to continue. And that's one of the things. There's always the issue of weather, from blizzards and heat waves, flash floods, tornadoes, of course, if you're out in our area. And you've got all of these issues, and they go through it. One of these, Egan talks about, he was riding out of Salt Lake City, and at sundown, he's starting out. It's a heavy snowstorm. His horse is knee deep in this stuff. He can't see the road, so he uses the wind, but what he doesn't realize is the wind actually shifts, and he ends up going southwest instead. He's very fortunate because he ends up crossing his own trail and ends up back at the station that he had just left. Now, he can't stay the night. He's got to go back out with a fresh horse, but, and that's why I say not only does he hold the record for the fastest ride, he might hold the record for the slowest one as well. Now, as I've mentioned this before, but we need to keep in mind, Horse and rider can cover nearly 20 miles in an hour on the Great Plains, but it could take a full day to cover the mileage between Carson City and Placerville, California. So you cannot say, you know, they will say the average speed across the entire thing is about 10 miles an hour. But if they're able to run full out, they do. But when they're in those mountains, they can't. And at night, it's hard to run full out because you have to be able to see where you're going as well. Another writer was William Campbell. And he writes that I once spent 24 hours in the saddle carrying the mail 120 miles to Fairfield, Nebraska with snow 2 or 3 feet deep. The mercury was around zero. I could tell where the trail lay only by watching the tall weeds on either side, and I often had to get out and lead my horse. Then when he gets to Fort Kearney, there was no one there and he had to go on. So he really he was supposed to get off at Fort Kearney, but he ends up going on anyway. And when he recounted his worst, many of them will talk about, you know, bison stampedes or things like that. His worst experience was with wolves. They refused to move when I rode at them, and my horse shied away at the smell of blood. I blew my horn, but that had no effect on the wolves. There was nothing to do but try to flank and outrun them. I gave my scared horse his head, and the wolves finally fell back when the lights of the next station showed in the distance. Sounds like he had a lucky escape there. Now, the point is, during the brief 19 months that this is in place, these writers would carry 35,000 letters. But they could never convince the normal person that it was worth $2.50 for a single page. And as the other things kept going on, they were never able to get the exclusive rights to mail that they had hoped for. The Washington kept paying the overland mail route the full amount, so they didn't get that exclusive the way they'd originally had for the oxen for the military bases, the way Sioux City had for all those military bases on up the river. It's that exclusivity that makes all the difference. One of those things about us, you know, we believe in the capitalistic system, but you know, given a chance, we want a monopoly. So they never got that set of exclusive rights, and in fact, things would happen. Majors will end up going bankrupt, and it was thought that these guys were as sound as the dollar. So this really shocked people. Russell had gotten into deep trouble because he was pressuring the War Department, trying to come up with other funding, and he was arrested for supposedly dealing in fraud for some of the different bonds. All of these things together means they end up bankrupt, and they're sold to Pony Express. They sold the Pony Express to Wells Fargo. And the irony is that Wells Fargo then continues on with it because the war now has disrupted the southern route. Once they can't cut through Texas any longer, since they're heading to a union state in California, and they're, you know, doing things for Washington. It's a Washington contract. They can't go through that the Santa Fe Trail anymore. So they continue on overland. And while because they keep all the people, they successfully carry the mail through, and with a speed no one thought possible, the reality is they could not outrun the future. And this painting, this drawing actually, which appeared in one of the Harper's Weekly magazine, is a very interesting one. This is supposedly, and you might notice he looks a lot like Buffalo Bill, but it's one of the Pony Express writers waving to the guys that are putting up the telegraph poles, and that's supposed to be in the Artist's Mine, Chimney Rock area. So even as they're doing all this, the telegraph is continuing on its way out through and across the plains. And on October 21st of 1861, with the connection of 2 wires, the transcontinental telegraph was complete and the Pony Express was out of business the next day. Yet I want you to think about it. What is the legacy of the Pony Express? Despite the financial failure, the Pony Express is really one of those great stories that we talk about all the time, much like we talk about Lewis and Clark. And, you know, there's the Pony Express, which had, you know, occupies a very high place in the American pantheon of folklore. And realize it's 160 years later. Had we not had the COVID things and we'd been able to do this last term when I originally proposed it, we would be doing this very much, very close to that 160-year anniversary of April 3rd, because they started in 1860 and it's 2020. I want you to think about something. The Pony Express failed to make a profit. That was their big failure. But they assembled the people with the talent and the courage that could make the job happen. Something people said was impossible. They did it on time, and they did it against all the challenges. And they did it due to their courage and their ingenuity. And if you think about it, you know, the entire concept of what we are as American is Yankee ingenuity and boundless courage. And these folks did that based on that. And that's why I think the Pony Express, despite the fact that it was never popular as far as, it was never successful as a business, has remained exceedingly popular throughout this entire time. And by the way, this is a statue of the horse and rider in St. Joseph, Missouri. St. Joseph, if you go there, calls itself the town of museums. There are many museums in that town, and one, I'm sure, is to the Pony Express. I'm going to ask all of you to go ahead and unmute yourself as we think about it, to talk about the different things you're aware of and to ask any questions. But as I said, my goal was to try and sort out the myths, the legends, and the facts, and I hope I've done so. And my goal, as I said also, was not to downplay or degrade the facts, but to elevate them, because I think what the Pony Express achieved is, in its time, nothing less than what we saw with the moonshot during our lifetime. It seems very similar. It didn't necessarily go anywhere, but it certainly motivated people to a higher level and excited them and brought them along. So with that, any questions, any thoughts, any statements? Are you all still out there?
Yeah, Russ, this is Bob. I just wondered about the logistics of taking care of all of these stations. You know, how did they get supplies, food, horses, personnel, all of that stuff from all the way across the country to those stations?
Well, and that was the beauty of the fact that they were already bringing supplies out to those folks at the, at the forts. So they were in that business. That's what they did. But your point is well taken. We're talking 500 horses, and you know some of them have to wear out and they have to be replaced. And you're talking about the food for all those horses. Now, also, you've got situations where those stations, as you saw, you ended up almost a month out of business for the stations in the area of Nevada due to that pyramid war. So that's a very, very big deal where they certainly had to deal with that. So they were able to do it because they were in they were in the shipping business. That was their job. But that's also why they started having trouble, because it cost so much money. They really couldn't maintain it more than a year. And that's why shortly after a year, when they could not get the government contracts to help subsidize it, they ended up out of business because they could not afford to keep doing it.
Do you have any idea how many employees they had with riders and station personnel and logistics, delivery personnel, all of the stuff put together?
They supposedly had 80, at any given time, they had 80 writers. They had somewhere around 200 to 400 station personnel. Because you think about all the stations they had, they might have actually had as many as 750. And again, those were pretty stable people, but also remember, they were really the ones at risk. If you consider it, think about the story of Wild Bill Hickok. Actually, that shootout that the first shootout that we know of that he's involved in is where it's at that Fairbury Rock Creek station. Just like today, where you have people to get off the interstate that you don't know if they're good or bad, you have that same thing back then, don't you? So it was a dangerous job, much more dangerous for those station personnel than it was for the people that were on the horseback. They at least had some control of their destiny as far as which direction they went.
Russ, I had a question. Was there only one rider going in each direction at all times, or did they start a second relay like 5 days later than the first one left Missouri?
Every day.
Every day they started a new.
Every day you started a new route, so that every day you had mail showing up in Sacramento. Every day you had mail showing up in St. Joe. So thank you for asking that. That's a very important point. And so once you got the process rolling, it had to keep going. So back to Bob's point, thus why you had to have so many riders. And what would happen is they would go their 100 miles, and then the concept was they'd rest up for about a day and a half, and then they'd be one of those that would pick up the mail to go back to get back to where they were. So it was that stream that goes both ways and happens continuously. For the record, they've identified something like 160 riders total over the year and a half. Because I mentioned Dan Drumheller. After that experience, and you had some riders that said, "Oh, I'm not going into that area," and he, of course, did because he took his oath seriously that this has to go through. But he only worked for him for 3 months. And essentially during the worst time during that Pyramid War. But you had people. They had to keep bringing in new people all the time. Now, the station hands generally stayed. Now, the bigger stations, of course, you had more people. But then again, I said a lot of those were on forts as well. Anybody else? Other questions? Was this the program you were hoping to hear?
Yep.
But that's always important. I try to put these out, and as you can see, since I'd originally intended to do this last term, it was meant to be the 160th anniversary. So, now it's almost the 159th of their failure. But it's so it. And again, failure is too big a word. It was a financial failure, but in the annals of American history, it's one of the great successes. It's one of the inspiring stories out there, and all the people who had been part of it were proud throughout their life. And I can't remember his name, but I read that the last of the writers would die in the 1950s. That seems almost impossible, but if you think about it, if this was 1860, they would have only been 90 plus another 15 if they were 11 or 12, because I think the one that died that late in 1955 had actually been one of the 11-year-olds that had worked for him at the very end. And so he was like 102 when he died. So that's amazing to think that stretches into our time. You know,
An 11-year-old is the average fifth grader.
yeah, exactly.
So
And
send
that's
him out there for 100 miles on a horse, going
yeah,
as hard as he can.
yeah. And that was the thing, you know. I mean, that's another aspect that kind of sometimes I think brings us up short, that we have to remember about history. It seems similar, and then you have to realize, oh my gosh, you know, if somebody's father died, they might become the main person working the farm at 8 years old. You know, they might be the one in charge of their little brothers or something, you know, at a very young age. So it's a major concept. When we dig into these things, suddenly we start to see how it's all different than what we might have expected. So now, if there are any other questions, I really want to take them, but I do want you to know this and others are available to be watched in case somebody missed it. But next week is our off week. There's no class for me next week. And then the week after that, we come back on Tuesday to do the Dr. Dunker leadership lectures, which will be a little bit different this term because I'm actually looking at specifics that Lincoln did, that Teddy Roosevelt did. We're going to take 2 classes to do this, but we're going to look at some specific instances in their lives talking about leadership and where they either succeeded or failed. So it'll be a little bit more focused than my usual, here's about the whole life of this person and the specific things they did. This time we're just going to actually look at, you know, to try and get it down to that less than an hour and a half or 2 hours, you know, get it focused. So I'm hoping you'll all come back for that. I will mention that I also have there'll be a Facebook class with the Lewis and Clark Encounter Center on November 1st as well. And that one is going to specifically be about Susan B. Anthony's visit to Sioux City. So I'm hoping you'll all stick around. We got more classes, we got more things, but we're essentially at it's kind of like halftime. You get next week off from me. So that works. I hope you enjoyed this. Also, if I don't have your email, if you got an email from me this week, then I have your email. But if I don't, please send me one at rgifford@russgifford.net. It's real easy. Just rgifford, russgifford@russgifford.net. And I'll get it, and I'll put you on the list so that you know about these things. Also, the reason I say that is it may be an off week for you next week, but what I'm going to try and do is, as you can tell, I probably had a few more stories for the wagons and for the steamboats than I was able to put in. So I'm thinking, what the heck, I'm going to go ahead and write those up, record them, and then I'll send you a link to them on my website. So, you know, it should only be about an hour, but it'll have a few stories from each of those to kind of tie this off. So if I have your email, you'll get that link. Does that work?
Sounds great.
All right. I want to thank each of you for being here. Does anybody have any other questions? You can unmute yourself and talk. I'll wave at you folks so that I can see you. Ed and Cindy, nice to see you. Audrey, Don, Donna, Glenn, Judy, hey, good to see you guys. And Grace, that's a great ceiling fan you got there. Bill, you should have something to talk about. You're St. Joe. Talk to us about it.
I was born in St. Joe and grew up near there, and so everything down there is Pony Express, like everything is Sargent Floyd up here. One thing I wanted to mention is that the Pony Express stables have been made into a museum, and the last time I was there, it's very nice, and it's a good museum to see. But close to that is the Patey House Hotel, and that was the headquarters. The stables were indeed a stable, and then near that is the Patey House, and that was actually the headquarters of the Pony Express. So you can go very easily there. Also on April 3rd is the other big event that happens in St. Joe, which is the killing of Jesse James. And
Oh, yeah.
the Jesse James house to where it's in the same area. It was much later, of course, but those are all right there together. And the last time we were there, they were really something to see.
Thank you very much for that. And I have gone to those, and I'm just super excited to go back. I'd intended to do it this time, but things just kind of got in the way. But I'm looking forward to it in the next year, certainly. So thank you for that. Anyone else? Ed, Cindy, anything? Nice to have you here.
Very, very enjoyable as always. I do have a side story since Cindy stepped out of the room a moment, but she, when she was growing up as a child in Denver, she had a record that sang about the Pony Express. So on our first major trip after we got married, St. Joe was included in that loop, so we could go to the Pony Express headquarters. And this has been quite a few years ago, but it was very nicely done. There's a nice movie at the beginning that gives the history, and it's very, very nice museum setup if anybody gets a chance to go down there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Oh boy. Glenn, anything? How you been?
Been fine, Russ, if you can hear me.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, we've finally figured out how to get into the 21st century and be able to be a part of this. So we certainly enjoy what you had to say tonight. We didn't get there right away. We were a little late joining up, but we'll try to be on time next time.
Well, and as I said, the others, if you missed any, we've been showing them now, so feel free to watch those as well. And if you need them, I can send you a link, and that's true for any of you. So I seriously, it's great to see all of you guys when I can see you, but it's nice to see your names and to hear your voices as well. It's been quite a while, and we all miss the fact that we can't get together in real life, but at least this is something. So thank you so much. Anybody, any other comments, any other questions, I'd love to have them. And if I don't have the answer, I will email you the answer. You know, that's also possible. So also, since this is halftime, you need to be thinking, what would you like to hear next term? You know, might as well start thinking about it now, because we do have, you know, the concept of next term. We don't know if we'll be face to face or if we'll be like this, but you might as well start thinking about it now. All right. Yes.
Did these people who were the writers, did they just like grab a bite of food as they were changing horses and ate on the way? And
If that.
Okay.
You know, if they might have some bread, they might have something else that they could grab, you know, be given and grab with them. But the idea was, you know, they wanted you moving and they wanted you constantly in motion. So, you know, obviously they might have to stop, but they tried not to. So, and that was one of the reasons why it was pretty much a 24 to 36 hour layover, because think about it, in the middle of the heat, you know, how dehydrated you would be. In the middle of winter, how frozen you would be. You know, the concepts were difficult at the very best. And that's, you know, under perfect circumstances, this all worked well, but they made it work even under the worst. I think they only lost one set of mail, and that was due, and one person. Now, they lost many station personnel, especially during that Paiute War, but, you know, they only lost one set of mail through that entire 18 and a half, 19 months. So impressive, and only one writer. So, and writers were pursued by natives during that at different times, but most of the time they did get away from it. So all difficult, and yet they persevered. And it's funny because if you listen to them talk about it in their writing back then, it comes so close to the neither sleet nor snow nor hail will delay us in our appointed rounds. I mean, it's very amusing from that point. So they took it seriously, and at that kind of money, they worked it seriously as well. But as you saw, in some cases, they couldn't work it very long. 3 months. I mean, my gosh, doing that every 3 days, that's a lot of effort. So, and of course, during their time off, during that convalescence, if you want to call it that, they would help out at the station as well. So, taking care of the horses mainly, because that's what they were hired for. They were hired. The concept was they wanted somebody born in the saddle. They were born horsemen. So, all right. Anybody else? I showed that we made it another hour and a half again, even though I'm shooting for an hour, but I tried. I did try, and thank you very much for your time, your patience, and your interest in these programs. You take care, and remember, not next week, but the week after, and on Tuesday, right? So if you haven't signed up already, please do. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Russ. Great series.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, guys.